Welcome to the amazing world. Today we are going to study about the French society in the 18th century before the revolution. As earlier mentioned, the French society was known as the Three Estates. It was similar to the Varna system in India. The king at the highest position of the ladder, the first estate of the clergy who belonged to the church and performed religious duties, just like the Brahmins in the Varna system. The second estate belonged to the nobility who did administrative work and worked in the army, just like the Kshatriyas. The third estate belonged to the commoners who can be put into three categories: the rich and educated bourgeoisie consisted of lawyers, merchants, businessmen, philosophers. The second group, the peasants and artisans, and the third group of landless laborers who worked on land owned by the clergy, nobility, and the bourgeoisie. To understand further how the social divisions impacted the revolution, let us understand this with the help of a chart. These three graphs will help us understand the social divisions which resulted in the revolution. With regard to population, we have 0.5% of the clergy who belong to the first estate, 1.5% of the nobility, and 98% the third estate, which was the largest. The land ownership, 10% belonged to the clergy, 25% belonged to the nobility, 65% belonged to the third estate. But again, out of the 65%, less than 30% actually belonged to the peasants and artisans. So overall, more than 60% actually belong to the clergy, the nobility, and the rich bourgeoisies. When it came to taxation, the burden of taxation was on the third estate, be it a bourgeoisie, be it a peasant, or a landless laborer. To understand this 100% taxation on the third estate, let us look how the third estate was burdened with taxation, while the first and second estate was not. The first estate, or the clergy and the nobility, enjoyed privileges by birth. They paid no taxes to the state, while the nobility enjoyed feudal privileges. They could ask the third estate to perform duties for them, in return for which they would pay the nobility. While the third estate of commoners had to pay taxes to the state called tally, to the church called tithe, and other indirect taxes. This burden of taxation on the third estate was threefold. First, they had to pay the tally, a tax to be paid to the state for administrative purpose, which was a fixed tax by the state. The tithe, a tax to be paid to the church. It was 1/10 of the agricultural produce. Be it a bourgeoisie, a peasant, an artisan, or a landless laborer, everybody had to pay 1/10 of the agricultural produce to the church. While other indirect taxes on goods had to be paid by the bourgeoisie. This burden of taxation brought unhappiness and was one of the social reasons for the revolution. To summarize the causes is division in society between the first estate, the second estate and the third estate. The first and second estate enjoyed privileges and paid no taxes. The nobility enjoyed feudal privileges, while the third estate of commoners were burdened with taxes, the tithe, the tally, and other indirect taxes. And lastly, the clergy, the nobility, and the rich peasants owned more than 60% of the land. To understand further the economic condition of France during this period was that France's economy was primarily based on agriculture. As we learned earlier, the peasants and farmers were burdened with taxation. There were times when poor harvest would trouble them in paying taxes. But it was during such times that taxes were raised, and it was really difficult for peasants and farmers to pay their taxes, while the bourgeoisie would somehow manage to gather the wealth. But a time came when they realized that why were they alone paying taxes while the nobility did not pay taxes? It was a time in 1788 that a subsistence crisis developed. It was mainly because the population increased from 23 million in 1715 to 28 million in 1789. As population increased, food production had to increase. But food production could not make pace with the population because of bad harvest. As I had mentioned, agriculture is the main occupation of the people. When there was bad harvest, the prices of bread increased. This burdened the poor farmers with taxation and prices increasing. The bourgeoisie, the peasants, the farmers, the landless laborers were bearing the burden of this price rise along with taxation. A time came when the bourgeoisie too were finding it difficult as their wages did not increase with the rise in bread prices. It was this subsistence crisis that led to the revolution. To summarize the points of the economic crisis are bad harvest resulting in price of bread skyrocketing. Wages did not keep pace with the price rise. The burden of taxation on the third estate. The subsistence crisis where the basic means of livelihood became difficult for everyone. And lastly, the widening gap between rich and poor peasants. Leave apart all these things. The Queen, Mary Antoinette, spent lavishly from the treasury while the people in the third estate were struggling to even eat one bread meal a day. Thank you and see you in the next video.